She found him in the ruins of a world that had already burned once ice. The smoke was still rising from the Velkrath relay tower when Princess Seraphine, Daver Orin, came down from the orbital skiff with 40 soldiers at her back and the taste of ash on her tongue. The tower had been a communications hub for 9-star systems. Now it was a sculpture of melted conduit and fused plating, 3 stories of it listing sideways into the blasted red soil of Kasara 4. 12 of her soldiers were dead. 49 station personnel were dead. And somewhere in what was left of the tower's sublevels, her intelligence people had tracked a single biosign, human, male, alive, who had been on station for 11 days before the Dropvith assault fleet arrived. 11 days. And he was still breathing. That was the part that made no sense. The Dropvith did not leave survivors. They were a siege civilization. Methodical, patient, geometrically precise in their contempt for lesser species. They had taken 14 worlds in 9 years. They had never left a single occupied building standing. They communicated in mathematics and expressed emotion exclusively through calculated advantage. They were, by every measure the Galactic Survey Commission had developed, undefeatable in direct engagement. Her father's generals had said so. Her father's generals were dead. And yet, Seraphine stepped over a fused Dravath war sphere, one of their automated exterminators. Reduced to a cracked shell of black composite and exposed circuitry, and then stepped over a second one, then a third. The floor of the relay sublevel was scattered with them, a dozen at least, each one detonated or shorted or torn apart in a different way. Some had been hit with focused electromagnetic pulses, crude ones, the kind you built from scavenged parts. One had simply been shot with a ballistic round in precisely the right place, a shot that had to have been taken from 12 meters in near complete darkness. One had been hit with something else entirely. Its casing was not cracked but restructured. The composite lattice rearranged at a molecular level, which should have been impossible without a stellar mass gravity source. What did this? Her lieutenant, Corda, said behind her. One person, said the tracking specialist, Evan, from her left. He was watching his instrument panel with the expression of a man who no longer trusted his instruments. One biosign. That's all I'm reading. One person, and they've been down here since yesterday morning. Alone, Corda said. Alone. Seraphine found him around the corner of a collapsed partition wall, sitting on an overturned equipment case and reading something. Not a datapad. A physical book, slim and battered, with a faded cover she couldn't read in the emergency lighting. He looked up when she turned the corner with a plasma carbine leveled at his chest, and his expression did not change. He was older than she expected, middle-aged, with a compact frame and a face that had spent a long time weathering things. He was wearing civilian clothes, slightly singed. He had a walking stick balanced across his knees. His eyes were quick and strange and looked, she thought, like they had already seen the outcome of this exact conversation and found it mildly interesting. Ah, he said. You brought soldiers. Sensible. He glanced at the book, seemed to decide something, and set it down on the case beside him. I was wondering when the backup would arrive. Who are you? Seraphine said. I'm the person who kept your relay station from being used as a Dravith tactical uplink for the last 11 days, he said. Which is, I think, more relevant right now than my name. Though I'm happy to provide that too, if you feel it's useful for your forms. She stared at him for a long moment. Corda, behind her, was making a small sound that might have been suppressed laughter or suppressed disbelief. Elias Caro, he said. Civilian contractor, theoretical systems architecture, semi-retired. I was on station to consult on the relay's harmonic modulation array when your Dravath friends arrived. He glanced at the nearest destroyed war sphere, the one with the ballistic puncture. They weren't particularly happy about it. Semi-retired, she repeated. I still do the occasional job. She lowered her carbine approximately 4 degrees. How many of those things did you destroy? 14 functioning war spheres, 3 dormant reserve units I got to before they could activate, and 1 reconnaissance drone I caught in the stairwell on day 3. He paused. That last one was genuinely unpleasant. Very fast. I had to be creative. Seraphine had read the draft technical assessment. War spheres were rated at a combat effectiveness level that required a 4-person strike team with specialized EMP ordnance to reliably neutralize single unit. How, she said, and it came out less like a question and more like a sound a person makes when mathematics stops working. He reached into his jacket and produced a small device, a jury-rigged thing, clearly hand-built, components she half recognized from relay station inventory and half couldn't identify at all. Jammer, he said, disrupts their target acquisition system at the resonant frequency of their sensor array. Took me about 6 hours to build on the first night. After that, I had to get a bit more improvisational. He turned the device over in his fingers with the casual familiarity of someone handling a tool they'd made 1,000 times. The Dravith are very good at what they do, but they have a tendency to assume that once they've classified something as a lesser species, that classification is permanent. It's a weakness, really, gets them into trouble. They've taken 14 worlds, Seraphine said. Yes, he set the device down. And they haven't updated their tactical doctrine since the 3rd one. Their war spheres still use the same basic sensor architecture they designed 40 years ago. Efficient, certainly. Elegant, even. But 40 years is a long time. He tilted his head very slightly. How long have humans been building things designed to kill other things? She blinked. It seemed like an odd moment for a philosophy question. Since before recorded history, she said. Quite right. About 300,000 years, give or take. Give or take. He stood, picking up his stick and his book. He was steady on his feet, she noticed. Not injured. Not even particularly tired looking. For a man who had spent 11 days fighting an alien extermination unit alone in a burning basement. The Draft have been doing this for, what? 200 years? 230? He shrugged. They're very good students, but humans have been taking notes for considerably longer. Now, he looked at her with those quick, strange eyes. I assume you have a ship. I'd quite like to not be on Kasara 4 anymore. She made a decision she couldn't entirely justify. You're coming with us, she said. Not as a prisoner. As a consultant, he said, and smiled. It was a small smile, slightly crooked, and she got the impression it was not entirely voluntary. I know. You're going to want to ask me a great many questions. Yes, she said. I am. Good, he said. I find that's usually where the interesting part starts. The interesting part, as it happened, started approximately 4 hours later when the Dravith fleet repositioned. Seraphine's ship, the cruiser Tessavar, had been holding a secondary orbit on the far side of Kasara Afor's moon, waiting for the ground team's return. By the time she and her people were aboard and the skiff was docked, the Dravith formation had shifted in a way her tactical officers called strategically ambiguous and her first navigator called, that means they know we're here. The fleet was not pursuing. It was repositioning. Moving into a configuration that, as Seraphine's tactical AI began to process the geometry, resolved into something that made her second navigator go very still at her console. They're not blocking our escape route, the second navigator said. They're blocking every escape route. The Tessavar's tactical display lit up like a diagram of a closing hand. They've done this before, Caro said, from the back of the bridge where Seraphine had brought him. Under observation, technically, but she'd found him watching the displays with a focused attention that made her want him, where she could see his face when he reacted to things. It's a siege formation, not a pursuit formation. They're patient. They'll wait for you to try something and then adjust. We have faster drives than their standard fleet units, her first navigator said. They have faster drives than your faster drives, Caro said, not unkindly. Their command ship. There, second cluster from the left. You see the configuration of those forward arrays? That's a temporal compression drive. They can effectively slow your local spacetime and arrive anywhere in this system before you do. Not before you get there, he paused. Before you left. There was a silence on the bridge with a specific texture to it, the texture of people recalculating their assumptions about their survival prospects. Then we can't run, Seraphine said. Not conventionally, no. He was quiet for a moment, watching the display. He had one hand wrapped around his walking stick and was tapping a slow, irregular rhythm on the grip. Not nervous, she thought. Something else. Thinking. You said your father's generals called them undefeatable in direct engagement. Yes, they're right. He glanced at her. But I didn't say anything about direct engagement. What did you say? I said they don't update their doctrine. And I said they have a tendency, once they've classified something as a lesser species, to treat that classification as permanent. He walked toward the main display, slowly, with the unhurried step of a man taking a stroll. May I? She gestured to the console. He leaned over it, with a familiarity that suggested he had stood at consoles like this before, many times, on ships that probably no longer existed, and began to work. The Dravath command structure is hierarchical, completely, absolutely hierarchical. The command ship gives orders. The fleet executes. There is no distributed decision-making because they consider distributed decision-making inefficient. He pulled up a frequency analysis of the Dravath fleet communication signals that her own tactical AI had been running for 20 minutes and hadn't meaningfully decoded. He looked at it for about 3 seconds and then began to adjust parameters. The strength of that system is its precision. Every unit knows exactly what it's supposed to do. The weakness is that if the command signal is disrupted, the fleet fragments, said Seraphine's chief communications officer, who had been watching with the expression of someone watching a card trick and trying to spot the mechanism. The fleet fragments, Caro confirmed, and fragmented units revert to last standing orders and attempt to reconnect, which takes time. Time during which the formation becomes locally incoherent enough with the right vector to create a corridor. He highlighted something on the display. Not an existing gap in the fleet, but a position 3 degrees off the Tessevar's current bearing. Here, if you're moving at maximum drive power at the moment the command signal drops, you'll be through before the formation can reconverge. How long does the signal drop last? If I do this correctly, about 40 seconds. And if you don't do it correctly, he considered this with genuine equanimity. Then the command ship notices immediately, and you have roughly 6 seconds before the fleet responds as a coherent unit, which would not be good. 40 seconds versus 6 seconds, she said. Those aren't the same number. No, he agreed. They're not. I'd recommend the 40-second version. How do you disrupt it? The same way I disrupted the war spheres, adjusted for scale. The Dravath used the same resonant carrier frequency for all their communications, fleet-wide. It's extraordinarily efficient. It also means that a sufficiently targeted disruption at that frequency will cascade through their entire communication architecture at once. He looked at her directly. I need access to your communications array, a few components from your engineering stores, and approximately 40 minutes. Seraphine held his gaze. She was a good judge of people. Her mother had trained her, and her mother had been extraordinary. And what she saw in Elias Caro's face was not the thing she had been bracing to see. She had been expecting confidence, the performed certainty of a man selling something. What she saw instead was more like calm. The deep, settled calm of someone who had done this kind of math before, who knew what 40 minutes of preparation felt like, who had already run the numbers and was waiting for her to run them too. 40 minutes, she said. Go, he went. 22 minutes into the 40, the Deathworld fleet began to move. Not the full reconvergence Seraphine had been watching for, not yet, but a shift, subtle and purposeful, in the positioning of two destroyer-class units on the near flank. Her tactical AI flagged it as a potential standard patrol adjustment. Her second navigator flagged it as the fleet beginning to feel around the edges of a decision. They know we haven't run, Corda said, from beside Seraphine's command chair. They're trying to understand why. They're curious, said Seraphine. They're not used to things that don't run. She had asked Corda what she made of Caro after the sublevel. Corda had been quiet for a moment and then said, with the precision she reserved for things she was not entirely certain of, he knows something about them that they don't know he knows, and he's been waiting for someone to use it with. She had paused. That's not entirely reassuring. No, Seraphine had agreed, it isn't. What was also not entirely reassuring was what her security officer, Brennan, had brought her 2 hours into the transit while Caro was in engineering and the ship was still 3 hours from jump range. Brennan had laid a datapad on Seraphine's chart table with the careful movements of a person placing something they wished they hadn't found. The datapad contained a communication log. A relay technician named Sarev, one of the 9 survivors from the Kasara station, currently in the Tessavar's medical bay with smoke inhalation damage, had transmitted 11 encrypted packets to an unregistered subchannel between days 4 and 9 of the Dravith occupation. The encryption was good. Not good enough for Brennan. The packets were routing coordinates, the relay station's internal sensor sweeps, the location of every maintenance corridor, everything the Dravith would have needed to narrow down a lone human survivor in a burning building. He was feeding them, Seraphine said. Yes, Brennan said. I think he thought that I'd let the others live if he cooperated, or that they'd let him live. She paused. They don't do that. No, Seraphine said. They don't. She looked at the log. And Caro survived anyway, because he kept moving. He never stayed in the same section twice. The war spheres following the coordinates would arrive and find nothing. Brennan was quiet for a moment. I don't know if he knew he was being tracked or if he was just. Careful, Seraphine said. Yes. She sat with that for a moment. The Deathworld had been given his location, repeatedly, by a man trying to negotiate his own survival, and Elias Caro had outlasted it by being exactly what he was. Someone who moved through systems as though he'd already mapped them, someone for whom stillness was a tactical choice rather than a default. She thought about the book on the equipment case. The man reading in the middle of a war zone, unhurried, because all of his hurrying happened in the calculations before the hurrying became necessary. What do we do with Sarev? Brennan asked. He's in medical, Seraphine said. He stays there until he's recovered. Then he faces a tribunal when we reach port. She looked up. He was afraid. He made the choice afraid people make. That doesn't make it nothing, but it doesn't make him a monster either. Brennan nodded once and left. Seraphine stayed at the chart table. She thought about what it would have felt like. 11 days, alone in the smoke, with the knowledge that someone was selling your location to the machines that wanted you dead, and the machines kept arriving and finding nothing because you were always one step ahead of the information that was meant to end you. She didn't know whether Caro had known. She suspected he had known by day 3 or 4. She suspected he had adjusted and kept going and not said anything about it and sat down with his book when the next wave of war spheres had been dealt with, because what else was there to do? She would ask him later. She thought she already knew the answer. At 31 minutes, Caro came back to the bridge with a device that looked like a communications module that had been reassembled by someone with a very different theory of how communications modules should work. He set it into the primary array, coupling with a practiced economy of motion, and straightened up, brushing something off his jacket. "Ready," he said. "That took 31 minutes, not 40. I found better components than I expected." He glanced at the tactical display. "Your engineers have good salvage instincts. Whoever stocks your emergency materials inventory. Chief Engineer Varys, she'll be pleased. She should be." He looked at the Dravith fleet formation and was quiet for a moment. Then, precisely as he had in the sublevel with the war spheres, that small, thoughtful pause, a man reviewing a set of calculations he had already done, he picked up his walking stick and stood at a very specific angle to the console. "On your word." Seraphine looked at her navigators. "Drive charge?" "Full," said the first navigator. "Vector locked?" "Locked." "Weapons hot?" "Hot." She looked at Caro. He was watching her, waiting. With that stillness, she was beginning to understand was not disengagement, but concentration. A person who had learned to hold very still at moments when stillness was the thing that mattered. "Do it," she said. He pressed something. For approximately 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then the Dravith fleet communication display, which had been a solid pattern of encrypted carrier wave traffic, went completely silent. "Drive," Seraphine said. The Tessevar moved. The gap was exactly where he had said it would be, 3 degrees off their prior bearing, a corridor between destroyer pairs whose formation had just hiccuped into something 300 meters wider than it had been. They went through it at full drive power with what felt like nothing to spare on either side, and the Tessevar's hull absorbed 2 glancing hits from automated defensive fire that had, for exactly 41 seconds, been operating without central coordination. Then they were through, and the stars ahead were clear, and behind them, the draft fleet was beginning to reconverge on an empty space. The bridge was silent for a moment. "We're clear," the first navigator said, with the measured tone of a person trying not to sound surprised. Jump calculations in 30 seconds. Seraphine became aware that she had been gripping the arm of her command chair hard enough to leave marks. She released it deliberately. 41 seconds, she said. "Caro, from the back of the bridge, I know. 1 second over, I apologize." She turned to look at him. He was doing that thing with the small, involuntary smile again. "Don't apologize," she said. "Just tell me how you knew. That it would work, that specifically. The gap was exactly where you said. The timing was exactly what you calculated. You built a device in 31 minutes that jammed a fleet-wide communication system without a test run." She looked at him steadily. "Elias Caro, civilian contractor, theoretical systems architecture, semi-retired." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, a consideration, a weighing, the sense of a person deciding how much of a door to open. "I've done this before," he said finally. "In various forms, on various scales. Against the draft, against several species who were, at the time, considered undefeatable." "How many times?" He thought about this with what seemed like genuine effort, as though the number was actually difficult to produce. "I've lost count, but I remember most of them." He looked at the star field ahead, the clear space they'd bought. "I remember all of them, actually. I just sometimes lose track of the number." She filed that sentence away. It did not make immediate sense. She would come back to it. "Where do we jump to?" she asked. "There's a problem you don't know about yet," he said. "In the Yavani system. The Dravrath have positioned a secondary force there, smaller than this fleet, but specialized. They're trying to recover a device, an old one." He glanced at her. "I left it there a long time ago. I'm afraid that's also my fault. You left a device in the Yavani system. I left it there because I wasn't done with it yet. It seemed safer than bringing it with me. He paused. In retrospect, several of my decisions from that period involved a certain degree of optimism. What does the device do? He was quiet for just a moment too long. It can reshape stellar systems, he said, if used as designed. If used incorrectly, he stopped. It needs to be retrieved before the drop raft understand what they're holding. I suspect we have approximately 6 days. 6 days. Seraphine looked at the star chart and then back at him and then at the star chart again. You have an extraordinary relationship with things that could destroy star systems, she said. I've been told, he said, with the tone of a man who has genuinely been told this before by multiple people in multiple languages. You're going to tell me everything, she said, all of it on the jump. Yes, he said, I think that's probably fair. He looked at her, and that strange deep calm was in his face again, but there was something else now too. Something that she thought might have been relief, the very specific relief of a person who's been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just tentatively been offered help. I think it's past time, actually. He listened for 11 hours. She interrupted 3 times, and each time he answered precisely and without deflection, and then waited for her to finish processing before continuing. He drank 2 cups of the Tessevar's terrible synthesized tea and didn't complain about either of them. At some point in the 3rd hour, in the quiet between 2 large facts she was still turning over, she asked him about the relay station, about Sarev. He was quiet for a moment. Then, day 4. I noticed the response times were improving. Not dramatically. If I hadn't been paying close attention, I might have written it off as fleet calibration. But they were arriving 4 to 6 minutes faster than the first 3 days, which meant the information they were using was getting more current. He turned his cup in his hands. I found the transmission node Sarev was using on day 5. I didn't disable it. Why not? Because if I disabled it, whoever was sending would know I'd found it, and the Dravith would know I'd found it, and they'd adjust. So I let it run. I just made sure the information being transmitted was always 4 hours out of date. She stared at him. You fed false positions through someone else's spy channel. I adjusted my movements to create a pattern that looked like a trapped person, narrowing their options, getting more desperate, retreating toward the lower sublevels. By day 8, the Warsphere deployments were all going to the lower sublevels. He paused. I was in the upper levels. It's quieter up there. She thought about that for a while. About a man who discovered he was being betrayed and turned the betrayal into a misdirection before breakfast and then went back to his book. Did you tell anyone? She said. There was no one to tell, he said. And then, quietly, and I didn't see the point of it. He was terrified. The Dravath used terror deliberately. They understand that fear makes leverage, that a frightened person will do calculations that a calm person wouldn't. It's one of their more sophisticated tactics. He looked at his tea. I wasn't angry at him. I was sorry for him. There's a difference. She thought about Brennan's dado pad and the tribunal waiting at port and said, nothing. The Dravrath have taken 14 worlds, she said, after a moment. In every one of those systems, there were people who made the same calculation Sarev made. People who cooperated because they were frightened and thought cooperation would protect them. Yes, he said. And it never did. No, he said, it never does. Because the Dravith don't operate on the logic of agreements. They operate on the logic of optimal resource allocation. A frightened person who cooperates is a useful tool until it isn't, and then it's waste material. They've never pretended otherwise. They're actually quite honest about it in their way. He looked at her, which makes them, in a strange sense, easier to fight than a species that lies to you about what it wants. You always know exactly what the Dravrath want. They want everything completely, and they want you to stop existing so they can have it unencumbered. That should be more frightening, she said. You'd think, he agreed, but I find I prefer a clear enemy to an ambiguous one. He took a sip of the terrible tea. It makes the math simpler. He told her about the device, the Anchor of Orenvel, as the Yavani called it, a stellar manipulation tool built by an ancient civilization, whose name he said carefully, and that she recognized as the vanished architects of the Third Age, who were, according to every historical record she had ever encountered, entirely mythological. He told her he had recovered it from a collapsing system 700 years ago. He said, 700 years in the same tone people used for last Tuesday. She interrupted him there. 700 years, she said. Give or take. He tilted his head. I don't age the same way most species do. It's a physiological thing. Complicated. You are not a baseline human, she said. I'm human, he said. Very much human in all the ways that matter. But baseline, he paused. No, not quite. There was something that happened a long time ago. A choice I made about what I was willing to be in exchange for more time to do the things I thought needed doing. He looked at his hands for a moment. I don't always think I made the right choice, but I've never found a good moment to stop. She looked at him across the small table in her chart room, and she thought, this is the person who kept 11 days of silence in a burning relay station against machines designed to exterminate everything that moved, alone, with a jury-rigged jammer and a walking stick and a book. This is the person who looked at a siege fleet and said, 40 minutes. This is the person who looks like a tired man, carrying something very old. The Anchor, she said, in the Yavani system. What does it do when used incorrectly? He told her. She was very still for a long moment. And the Devrath are trying to use it. They're trying to understand it. Once they understand it, they'll try to use it. And they won't know what they're holding until they try, and by then it will be. He stopped. Yes, they're trying to use it. And it needs to not be used. Not by them, not by anyone, not for what they have in mind. And you know how to stop it. I know how to stop it, he said. I've been planning how to stop it since I found out they were in that system. He looked at her with that measuring look. But I need the Tessivar to get close enough for the plan to work. And for the Tessivar to get close enough without being immediately destroyed, I need someone who commands Tessivar level of firepower and is willing to fly toward a Drobrath secondary fleet on the say-so of a semi-retired civilian contractor. She looked at him. I've flown into worse on less, she said. I know, he said. I looked at your record while I was building the jammer. You have a very interesting record. She stopped. When did you have time to look at my record? I multitask, he said. The Yavani system was a triple-star configuration with 7 planets, 4 of them inhabited, and a Devrath secondary fleet of 63 ships arranged around the 3rd planet like a crown that knew it was a threat. The Anchor of Orenvel was on that planet's surface in the ruins of a structure that the Yavani called the Still Place and the historical database called Possibly Architectural, Possibly Ceremonial, Origin Unknown. Caro knew its origin. The architects used it to stabilize newly formed systems, he said, as they came out of jump into the outer edge of the system, to prevent stellar instability, to adjust orbital mechanics, to shepherd things in the early ages, when the galaxy was younger and less settled. It's a constructive tool, very powerful, very precise. He paused. In the hands of someone who doesn't understand it, who tries to weaponize what is essentially a system-scale stabilizer, the feedback effect would. You explained the feedback effect, she said. Yes. I just wanted to say constructive tool once more, for my own sense of. He stopped. Never mind. The plan. The plan was, she had to admit, extraordinary. It was also, in a way she was beginning to recognize as specific to Elias Caro, deeply unpleasant for every participant in the short term in exchange for being the thing that actually worked. It required the Tessivar to do 3 things simultaneously that the Tessivar was not designed to do simultaneously. It required Seraphine to give an order that she had already given twice in her career, both times in genuine last resort conditions. It required Caro to go to the surface of the third planet alone through the Draft fleet in a craft small enough not to register as a serious threat, which meant a maintenance skiff rated for 2 people and a crate of supplies, and to reach the still place before the plan's other components completed, and to do something to the anchor that he described in technical terms she could follow, but that resolved, emotionally, to unmake what the Dravith have begun. "You're going alone," she said. "The skiff can only hold 1 person if I also need to carry the equipment. The Dravith will detect it." Yes. That's why the Tessivar does the 3 things simultaneously, so that the Draft fleet is dealing with 3 problems that look like immediate military threats, while I am not immediately military threatening. You'll look like a maintenance drone. I will look exactly like a maintenance drone. I've modified the skiff's signature already. They'll scan it, classify it as debris adjacent, and stop paying attention. He paused. Probably. The classification persistence is quite reliable. I've tested it. He said this in a way that managed not to specify when or against whom. She looked at him. He looked back. The chart room's light was the blue-white of a triple star system at long range, and it made his face look older and stranger, and somehow more exactly like what he was than it had before. "If this doesn't work," she said, "if this doesn't work, the Tessivar should jump immediately and get as far from this system as possible, because the feedback event will propagate at approximately." "That's not what I meant," she said. He stopped. "If you don't make it back," she said, "after everything, 700 years and all the things you've stopped, and all the devices you've hidden in collapsing systems, and all the fleets you've walked away from." She was not sure entirely why she was saying this. There was something about the matter-of-factness of the way he discussed his own death that made her want to push back against it. "You would just. I would have done what I could," he said, quietly, not resigned, factual. "It's never enough. There's always more to do. But you do what you can with what you have, and you keep going until you can't, and that's," he stopped. "That's what it is to be what I am, I think. To be human in whatever form that takes. You keep going. You find the gap in the formation, and you go through it." She held his gaze. "Then find the gap," she said, "and come back." Something crossed his face. Not the involuntary smile this time, something quieter. "I'll do my best," he said. "I usually do." The Tessivar did the 3 things simultaneously. The first was a targeting run on the fleet's leftmost flank, all weapons hot broadcast across every channel in the kind of aggressive forward posture that the Draft had learned to read as the opening of a direct engagement. Direct engagement was the one thing they were absolutely, documentably, unimpeachably better at than anything they had ever faced. The second was a communication burst on the Draft command frequency. Not disrupted this time, but seeded with a signal that Caro had built during the jump. A signal that translated in the precise mathematical language that Drobareth used for formal communications as, "We are in possession of the anchor. We propose a negotiation." This was entirely false. But the Dravith command structure, Caro had explained, could not dismiss a negotiation signal without processing it at command level, which meant the command ship was doing 2 things at once, which was one more thing than it was designed to do. The third was a weapons discharge directly into the debris field on the system's near side, a discharge calibrated to look exactly like the beginning of a mine-laying operation. The Draft response to mine-laying was automatic and immediate and pulled 2 destroyer wings out of the formation. In the gap between the withdrawn destroyers, moving at exactly the speed of uninteresting debris, a maintenance skiff traveled toward the third planet. Seraphine watched the skiff on the Tessevar's long-range sensors, a tiny blip in a forest of Dravith ship signatures, and she held the three-thing operation together with her officers through pure coordination and the specific variety of controlled determination that she had learned from her mother and then from her mother's wars. The draft command ship began to reconfigure. Not panicking, the draft did not panic, they recalculated, but clearly operating at a level of simultaneous inputs it had not expected. The fleet formation became, for approximately 4 minutes and 30 seconds, slightly less coherent than it had been. 4 minutes and 30 seconds. The skiff reached the third planet and dropped below sensor resolution in the atmosphere. Seraphine pulled the Tessevar back. Not a retreat, a repositioning. Something that looked, she hoped, like a force reconsidering its approach. Buying time. She looked at the planet on the main display. The still place was on the surface. Cairo was on the surface. Somewhere in the ruins of something 3,000 years old, a human being who had been doing this for 700 years was, once again, doing it alone. Time since surface contact, she asked. 14 minutes, Corda said. Estimated window before the draft recalibrate and reacquire? 22 minutes, if we're lucky. Will need to be. 22 minutes. She watched the planet. The still place was exactly as he had left it. That was the wrong way to think about it. It had been 3 centuries since he'd been here, not last week. But some places had that quality, a permanence that outlasted the minds that built them. The architects had built for permanence. They had built for a scale of time that made the draft empire look like a brief squall on a long ocean, and the structure around him now was shot through with a stillness that was almost gravity, almost music, almost the specific hum of a thing that had been designed to last. He stood at the entrance for a moment, longer than was strictly necessary, with his equipment case in one hand and his walking stick in the other. The walls were covered in the same notation as the anchor itself, notation that was not quite script and not quite mathematics and not quite musical notation, but partook of all three, the written form of minds that had thought in frequencies and orbital periods, and the deep grammatical structures of stellar formation. He had spent 6 years learning to read it. He still, sometimes, found lines he had to think about. There was one on the eastern wall, just inside the entrance, that he had puzzled over for the entirety of the first time he'd been here. He read it now. He understood it now, though he hadn't then. It said, in the approximate translation he'd arrived at after 30 years of refinement, all tools are also records of the hands that use them. He thought about the war spheres in the relay sublevel. He thought about the jammer in his jacket. He thought about Seraphine Davar Orin on the Tessevar's bridge, holding a 3-pronged operation together with the steady hands of someone who had been trained for exactly this and had not yet had occasion to know it. He walked into the chamber. The anchor was where he had left it. A hexagonal column of material that was not quite metal and not quite crystal, 4 meters tall, covered in notation that was not quite written language, set in the center of a chamber, whose floor had not yet finished calculating something it had started 3,000 years ago. The draft had been here. He could see their instruments, precise, elegant things, laid out in the geometric patterns they used for systematic analysis. A civilization expressing itself in right angles and exact distances. They had been careful with it. They had, he could tell, been impressed by it in whatever way the Dravrath expressed a thing like awe. They had begun a process of activation that would, in approximately 19 hours, have results that he had spent 11 days in a burning relay station, partly to avoid having to think about. He set down his equipment case, opened it, and got to work. The notation on the anchor was not a language in any sense he had encountered in the first 2 centuries of his life. In the subsequent 5, he had found 14 texts that partially described it, spent 6 years in what amounted to total immersion with the only remaining native speaker of its root form, and worked out the last piece of the grammar during a very long night on a ship that was trying to shake itself apart in a stellar corona. He ran his fingers along the notation now and felt the structure of it, the logic underneath it, the specific feel of a thing that had been built by minds that thought in deep time. The draft had activated the first stage of the anchor's power sequence. Could feel it. A vibration at the base of the column, not physical exactly. More like a pressure against the part of him that had changed 400 years ago when he had made his choice. He began to reverse it. It was not simple work, and it was not quick work, and it required, at several points, a particular brand of improvisation that he had once described to a colleague as doing the right thing with the wrong tools in conditions that make both worse. At one point, something in the activation sequence pushed back and he had to find a different approach, and the approach he found was one he had not used in about 150 years because it had then been fairly destructive to everything immediately adjacent. He adjusted for that. At the 12-minute mark, without pausing his work, he found himself humming something. Quietly, under his breath, a tune from a long time ago, from a place that no longer existed in quite the form he remembered it. He didn't always notice when he did this. A colleague, centuries back, had told him he did it when he was working through the hardest part of a problem, the part where the solution was clear, but the execution required the kind of sustained precision that used up most of a person's available attention and left a small remainder that expressed itself in sound. He supposed that was probably accurate. He had never been able to stop doing it. 18 minutes in, with the anchor sequence fully reversed and the initialization data cleared, he stood up and became aware that he was mildly shaking, not from fear, from effort, and from something more like grief, the particular grief of standing in the work of minds that had made extraordinary things and finding it in the hands of people who wanted to unmake. He had felt this before. He felt it every time. He picked up his equipment case. Then he stood still for a moment in the humming silence of the still place with his hand on his walking stick, and he thought about the 9 systems that had used the Kasara relay. He thought about the 12 soldiers who had died in the Dravrith assault. He thought about the princess who had come down with 40 soldiers at her back and found him in the basement and lowered her weapon approximately 4 degrees and made a decision she couldn't entirely justify. He thought, time will tell whether this was enough. It always does. He walked back to the skiff. He's ascending, Corda said. Seraphine had been watching for it and still almost missed it. The skiff's signature emerging from the atmosphere in the gap between 2 Drabrith destroyer patrols, moving at exactly the pace of something uninteresting, moving the way a man who had done this a very long time moved when he needed to not be seen. Get us into retrieval position, she said. The Tessavar moved. The Dravrith fleet was reconverging. They had finished recalibrating, and they had not found anything in the communication burst to negotiate with, and the mine laying that was not mine laying had been identified as not mine laying, and they were, once again, the focused, geometrically precise, contemptuous engine they had always been. But the skiff was already through the near flank gap, which was closing, which had been 4 seconds from closing, which Seraphine only knew because Corda called it, and Seraphine had spent 21 of the last 22 minutes calculating exactly where the gap would be at exactly this second. The skiff docked. Seraphine was on the bridge, and she did not go to the dock. She waited. She heard the dock clamp lock through the hull, and she waited, and then Caro walked onto the bridge with his equipment case and his walking stick and his slightly singed jacket, and he said, "The sequence is cleared. The anchor is dormant. The Dravith have lost 11 days of activation work." "Jump?" her first navigator asked. "Jump?" Seraphine said. The Tessivar jumped. In the silence of faster-than-light transit, with the Dravith system behind them and the star charts ahead full of things that needed doing, Seraphine looked at him across the bridge. "You were shaking," she said. He looked down at his hands, mildly surprised, as though he had forgotten and was now remembering. "Yes," he said. Was that unusual? He considered the question. "Less unusual than it used to be," he said, which might be age, or might just be honesty. He looked at her. "I was afraid it wasn't going to work. But you went anyway." "I usually am afraid it isn't going to work," he said. "It doesn't actually change the math. He stopped. It just means you understand the stakes clearly. And understanding the stakes clearly is, I think, the most honest thing a person can do." He looked at the star charts. The rest of it, the devices, the jammers, the gap in the formation, that's just craft. Craft you learn. Craft you carry. Understanding the stakes and going anyway, that's the human part. That's always been the human part. She looked at him for a long moment. "Will you tell me the rest?" she said. "The 700 years, all of it." He was quiet for a moment. "It's a long story," he said. "We have time." "Yes," he said, and something in his face settled. The way a thing settles when it finds the thing it has been looking for and didn't quite know it was looking for. "I suppose we do." She pulled a chair to the console beside him. She called for 2 cups of the Tessivar's terrible synthesized tea. He took his without complaint and held it in both hands in the way of a person who has learned to be grateful for small warmths in long, dark corridors. "Start at the beginning," she said. "The beginning was a long time ago," he said, "and a long way from here. And the stars were younger, and so was I, and I had," he paused. "I had not yet learned to count the things that mattered. I thought I knew which things mattered. I was wrong about several of them. I got better at it. Slowly." He took a sip of the tea. "I'm still getting better at it." "Go on," she said, and he did. The Tessivar moved through the dark between stars, and outside the viewport, the galaxy was enormous and old, and full of things that needed attending to. And in the chart room, a princess and a man who was older than most civilizations sat across from each other with terrible tea going cold between them, and he talked and she listened, and somewhere in the middle of it, she began to understand what she had found in the basement of the relay station. Not a weapon, not a tool, not a consultant, but something rarer and stranger and more specific. A human being who had been paying attention for a very long time and had not yet stopped. Much later, after the story had run its long course through the dark, after the tea was cold and the star charts had shifted and the Tessivar was almost to the next jump point, she asked him the question she had been holding since the relay station. "Why do you keep going?" she said. "After everything. You've seen it fail. You've seen what you stopped come back in different forms. The Dravith aren't the last. You know that." He was quiet for a while. "There was a man I knew once," he said. "Long time ago. I asked him something like that. He told me, and I'm paraphrasing, he was much more eloquent than I am. He told me that every decision creates ripples, that you can't always see where they go. You can't always know whether the thing you did today becomes the thing that matters in 100 years or 1,000. You just have to." He paused. "You just have to make the decision you can stand behind, and then make the next one, and keep making them." He looked at her. "The ripples are still going, all of them. Every decision, every gap in every formation, every device returned to dormancy in every ruined building on every world I've ever been on. I can't see where they go, but they're going." He set down his cold tea. That's enough, I think. Most days, that's enough. She thought about her father's generals, all dead. She thought about the 12 soldiers on Kasara Aforth and the 9 systems that had used the relay. She thought about 41 seconds of silence in a Dravith fleet communication network, and a corridor through a siege formation, and a skiff descending into a planet's atmosphere at the speed of something uninteresting. Ripples, she said. Ripples, he said. She nodded. Outside, the stars moved. There's a Dravith staging post in the Maravith system, she said. They've been operating there for 6 months. Our intelligence says they have 17 ships and a ground installation we don't have good data on. He looked at her. 17 ships, he said, and a ground installation we don't have good data on. Interesting. He picked up his walking stick. He picked up the slim, battered book and looked at it for a moment and set it in his jacket pocket. What kind of installation? We think signal-related, possibly communications, possibly something else. Possibly something else, he said, in the tone of a man who has heard possibly something else before and knows it covers a variety of interesting contingencies. How long until we can be there? 14 hours. I'll need your engineering stores again. Chief Engineer Varys will be delighted. Good. He stood. Then I'd better get started. He walked toward the door with the unhurried step of a man taking a stroll, and at the door he paused and looked back at her over his shoulder. Just for a moment, just long enough to confirm something. And then he was gone. Seraphine turned back to the star charts. 14 hours to Maraveth, 17 Dravith ships, and a ground installation that was possibly something else. A man in her engineering stores who would take 14 hours and build something precise and improbable and exactly calibrated to the gap in the formation that no one else had known was there, she thought. Time will tell whether we did good. She thought it always does. She began to plan.